In this session, Technology, we are really excited to be presenting an idea that I've been super interested in at the World Around for a long time, which is the relationship between technology and land. And we'll be looking at different scales from handheld devices to gigantic infrastructures that will utilize future technologies using landscapes across the Americas. As the people that we'll be presenting will discuss, that these types of connections and relationships are on us as designers and people in the design community to make the most of. First of all, we'll be hearing from the artist Simon Denny, an international figure who's been exploring these ideas between technology and technologists, relationships between labor practices, territories, and infrastructures. And then we'll be, and also he'll be presenting his recent exhibition, Proof of Stake. And then following that, we'll have a presentation by Holly Jean Buck, who is an academic, a researcher, and a writer, and her work will be, it's an opportunity to think about the really big picture of technology and infrastructure and land, and how to find and whittle down some of these extremely complicated ideas into an accessible format. These two different scales and different individuals will come together in a live conversation following the presentations, moderated by Luisa Prado de Oliveras de Martins. Thank you so much to Luisa for moderating this session. She's an artist and a researcher based in Berlin. And we'll be also hoping to have more of your questions from the audience. We really enjoyed the debate and discussion that we had during the first session. After this presentation, we'll be wrapping up with ecology, and so I will see you again in 1 hour. So thanks for watching and enjoy. Over to Simon Denny.
I'm Simon Denny, here in Berlin in my studio. I make exhibitions and projects about technology, technologists, people that make technology, the promises and visions of those people, and how that plays out for other people. Also property and ownership and connection to other things that make technological objects, like resources from the ground and minerals. So I'm really interested in the way that land is framed, interpreted, and kind of used. I guess my work is always focused on trying to foreground how material these things are, who makes it, what's it made from, also how they're connected to where we live and how we live. One doesn't necessarily think of the earth when one looks at one's iPhone or when one is buying a cryptocurrency. When you have a Mac in your hand, the minerals would make up the components of that, and the labor and all of the other things that make these objects are, very much in specific locations in specific parts of the world. Many minerals that come out of the ground in remote parts of Australia that go into those phones, for example, but also from Africa, different parts of the continent, like the Congo. So the people that design the objects, often they're living in California. The people that, extract the raw minerals for those objects are often in very different parts of the globe. When I made a recent project, Mine, which looked at the context of extraction from minerals to data, one of the sculptural gestures that I was interested in working with was making one-to-one sized portraits of machines used for mining minerals. And the mining industry is more and more automated these days. There's fewer and fewer people involved in the labor of extraction. And there are proliferations of these kinds of vast, for a human scale, machines, which are very heavy. They're often made of steel and, big, loud, chunky machinery. I wanted to make a translation that focused on what these machines do, also connecting them to the more user-based end and the rest of the industries. One can imagine a very near future when one person can own a whole mine and nobody else works there, which I think is a really stark contrast to what we think of mining in the past, especially if you think about industrial action and the history of kind of like the struggle between like labor and capital. I recently made an exhibition called Proof of Stake, which is at the Kunstverein in Hamburg. It's an exhibition that tries to unpack some of the context around blockchains and artists working with blockchains, but also some of the themes that blockchains have brought to the fore of discussion around technology. Proof of stake is the name of a blockchain consensus mechanism, which is core to the way that blockchains work, that moves away from energy-intensive ways of working that rely on heavy amounts of processing power towards instead other ways of distributing power within the network that is based on who owns what part of the network. So the idea that ownership equals power, it really brings to the foreground these questions about who gets to own what type of properties and what infrastructure does to the structure of ownership and value, which I think is really relevant in blockchains. There's been a lot of discussion around the amount of power, the amount of electronic processing power that is used to run these systems and therefore to support the distribution of NFTs and other blockchain-based assets. It's an interesting debate because there's a history to talking about the amount of power that is used to power any type of infrastructure. And for me, that's really interesting to think about, again, in the context of both mineral extraction and the way that land is then framed as resources in order to be put into industrial systems of extraction, but also the role of art in framing things as assets to be distributed in particular ways. So landscape painting, topographical painting that is sort of canonized as European white art history in New Zealand is also a tool for framing land use as resources and as commodity. And maybe we can think about other ways in which the framing of cultural products is also producing a particular type of possibility for assets and therefore of a particular commercial frame for value in a broader sense. And the people who are in charge of designing those systems and I guess enforcing and producing those ways of seeing landscapes, be they the metaverse virtual landscapes or very material versions of landscapes, which I think artists are processing and thinking about in really amazing ways.
I'm Holly Jean Buck. I am a writer and a geographer and an environmental social scientist, broadly working on environment and sustainability, very specifically thinking about removing carbon from the atmosphere. We have all of these technical solutions. We have roadmaps. We know what we need to do to address climate change, but we're not because of social structures. So that's like the big wicked problem. On a basic level, I wanted this book to be an introduction to both the carbon removal methods and the solar geoengineering techniques that are being researched. Geoengineering is a big umbrella term that includes anything that is large scale, like planetary scale, going to have a planetary impact, and intentional. So people talk about things like solar geoengineering, that is reflecting some amount of incoming sunlight back up into space to cool the planet. That would be intentional and planetary. People also talk about removing carbon from the atmosphere or carbon removal, which would be intentional and could be planetary if it was done by enough people in enough places. It feels familiar to say that, we're going to use technology to address climate change. And if we have a standpoint that's not just putting on like our special carbon glasses and seeing all the carbon flows, if we can put that aside and say, okay, who are the users of this land? Who knows how to take care of it? Thinking from the land as a starting point, I think can be really generative in getting to better case implementations of these technologies. So net zero means some amount of positive emissions that's balanced by some amount of negative emissions. Why do we even have any positive emissions, right? And the reason is basically we don't have quite all the technology that we need to be fully decarbonized. There's some things like decarbonizing agriculture, fertilizer production, aviation and shipping are challenging. You know, we're going to have to build up this whole new hydrogen infrastructure. We're just behind on all of this stuff, right? We need to electrify everything, increasing solar capacity, building offshore wind, investing in geothermal. And then once we decarbonize electricity, we have to think about outfitting cement and steel and other types of industrial facilities with carbon capture and storage to decarbonize industry. The solutions exist, but we need support for them, and we're not going to get support unless we're talking about doing them right, because there's definitely a right way and a wrong way to implement any of these things. I mean, even something that might sound as good as planting a forest might not be good if that's land used by somebody for something that's important, whether that's, you know, their own land traditionally, or if it's used for food. You don't want to say, okay, sorry, carbon needs come first. And so if communities aren't engaged in that or leading that work, it won't necessarily work over time. A lot of these communities are depopulating, and, you know, manufacturing has left, agriculture has shrunk and employs less people. They're wondering what's going to be the economic basis for our town. Are our aquifers going to be depleted? People have a lot of environmental questions that aren't always framed in terms of climate change or the way people in coastal cities might frame them. But with carbon removal at scale, both industrial and, you know, agricultural based, land based methods could really bring more investment and support to these communities if they're designed well. So design is one of the places where infrastructure and culture are meeting, and that intersection is critical because we really want people to be desiring this new infrastructure and supporting it, because it is going to have a cost. It is going to be a departure, and, you know, without that demand, it won't work. So designers have a huge role in being a bridge between, you know, users or communities, or however you want to talk about them, and engineers. Designers are going to be better trained if they're thinking more holistically. I also think that architecture has concentrated a lot on the urban as a site, and we need to also be thinking about, you know, rural design, because that's where these solutions take place. That's where renewable energy is deployed. Sure, some of it will be in the cities, but a lot of it will be in rural areas. And these are the areas we need to revitalize too. It's really a conversation that needs to include everybody working together. And right now, people in the global south are mostly left out of a lot of this. So we're not even part way to getting everybody we need to build these solutions in ways that'll be robust. Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can talk about things like carbon removal or even the land required for renewables, which is also huge, without talking about land and land back and Indigenous communities. I think meaningful engagement needs to be defined by the communities, not by, you know, the outsiders that are hoping for the engagement. We have a huge historical responsibility in the United States for all these legacy emissions. So if we have the technology to start cleaning some of that up, we should be doing that.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here and following the programming with us. My name is Luisa, and I'm really, really happy to have Holly and Simon here with us today. Thank you both for being panelists here. And thank you to the Guggenheim for inviting. I wanted to start this panel by thinking, or since we're talking about land and technology and ecology today, I wanted to start this panel with a prompt and a reflection. So a critical and urgent way to think about technology is through its relationship to land. And here we're understanding technology in a broad sense, right? Something that spans the sector itself, the resources that are needed to build each product, the planetary conditions and contexts that technology has enabled and engendered. In the context of the dramatic political, environmental, and cultural changes triggered by technology and its related practices and products in the past decades, and I would say perhaps particularly since the turn of the 21st century, some sectors of society have become increasingly resistant to how the technology industry has benefited from a continuum of extractivism and violence that stretches back hundreds of years and includes today's practices of land grabbing, land buybacks, mineral mining, pollution, and more. Practices that stretch, as I was saying, through hundreds of years. So over the past few years, scholars, for instance, Michelle Murphy or Kim Tallbear, have extensively discussed how the disruption of land and body relations constitute a form of colonial violence, and a form of violence that disrupts these relationships not only in let's say the material sense, but that disrupt also, that have intergenerational effects, that have effects that accumulate throughout generations. And these, and according to, for instance, Michelle Murphy, whom I just mentioned, these forms of colonial environmental violences are made possible by a regulatory regime that understands that there are acceptable levels of pollution, and that therefore grants permission to pollute to certain bodies, certain sectors, like the technology sector, for instance. And particularly, I think it's very interesting to think about how this regime that understands that that there are these acceptable levels of pollution have to think about the cultural effects of that, the political effects of these practices, and particularly how they affect Indigenous, Black, and Brown communities. So drawing on that, I was thinking we could start our conversation with some reflections from both of you, but I think this particularly, perhaps let's start with Holly, about how you have dealt with the relations between land and ecology and technology in your work. Holly, in particular, let's start with you, as I said. In your recent book, After Geoengineering, Climate Tragedy, Repair and Restoration, I was very struck by the descriptions of sites you visited. And I wanted to ask, to start this conversation, how have the relations between land and technology informed your work?
Yeah, thank you for that question. You know, I think that we have to step back and also think about capitalism, so that it operates by expropriating value from both workers and land. It relies on cheapening labor and cheapening land, right? And so that relationship between land and technology is totally mediated by capitalism, which is so hegemonic that people sometimes see technology as kind of a stand-in for capital. And it's really hard to imagine a non-capitalist or non-extractivist relationship between technology and land. There just aren't very many familiar models for it. And so then I think what happens is that we don't consider how technologies could work with the land or with ecosystems for aims of restoration or regeneration, because they're already associated with these capitalist forces of degradation. We also don't think about, how they could produce new social relations. And it's a huge missed opportunity, really, because the ecological devastation we're facing actually, I would argue, needs technology. We do need renewable energy at scale, as well as other decarbonization technologies. It's going to require some extraction. It's going to require land. So we have to figure out how to use these technologies with different sets of social relations, even though we have very few models that help us imagine what that might look like. So that's part of my project, part of the way there. It's a big challenge.
Thank you. That's very, very important. I think particularly this distinction between capitalism and technology, and understanding that these things are distinct concepts is super, super important. And I think it also perhaps relates to Simon's work and how you've created a number of exhibition projects on mining, from resource extraction to data mining. And perhaps that's a nice thread for you to explore.
Yes, thanks so much. And thanks also to the organizers of this event. It's a really special thing to be a part of, and watching along also the other previous panels. It was really compelling material. So congratulations for that. Yeah, I mean, I think maybe to add on to Holly's, urgent distinction there's maybe another distinction which relates to the curatorial project I mentioned in the video, Proof of Stake, which talks about, imagining mining through other metaphors that are often used in particular types of technology, blockchain technology, and trying to unpack those a little bit, because I think when I was curating this exhibition, I was thinking also about like who gets to claim what technology is. And maybe that's another important distinction to make around, if we're going to kind of separate technology from capitalism, maybe we also get to question what is called technology. I think in my own work, one of the ways which I have tried to focus on that is to look instead at industry, and maybe that's another way of speaking to technology. So a lot of the work I did in the mine projects and in Proof of Stake was to look at the rhetoric of industry and the claims of industry and a particular type of industry done by particular kinds of people, which I think is different than technology as a whole. So maybe that's something I can say.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Holly, do you have anything else to say, or can we move on, think about something else?
Well, let's keep going. I mean, I'm sure we'll come back to these really big picture questions.
Okay, so maybe moving on, I wanted to ask you, so for many people whose worlds are in close proximity to climate science and policy, the question at the moment is not if societies will decarbonize, but how. And the question is, what are some of the considerations needed for fair and just pathways? And here, I think it's important to make a distinction between a techno-solutionist approach that claims to fix climate breakdown and other modes of repair, and suggests that the how is more to do with social-political or organizational dynamics, such as asymmetric power relations and competing visions of more and just equitable futures. And this is obviously a question for both of you, but I think, Holly, I think your work really relates to that. And particularly, I wanted to ask you, what are some of the considerations that, maybe building also on the conversation that we started, what are some of the considerations needed for fair and just pathways?
Yeah, so before I talk about those considerations, which are at the heart of it all, I also want to point out that sometimes things that sound like they would be a technical fix or look like one actually have really deep political and social considerations right underneath the surface. And that's because capitalism is really not adequate at delivering some of these technical fixes. So looking at some of the decarbonization roadmaps, they rely on pretty massive layouts of new technologies, new infrastructures. It looks like a technical fix because it's on a graph or in a model, but to get to that level, we need really deep social change to finance, permit, build, all of the stuff. And it's just not happening, as we can see, right? So something like carbon capture and storage looks like a technical fix. Capitalism has not delivered this. This technology has existed for decades, and we still have, around 20 facilities for it around the world instead of, the hundreds that some of these technocrats predicted we would need. We're just not getting there without the social transformation. So in terms of what's needed for fair and just pathways for decarbonization broadly, I think we can look at distributive justice. So first analyzing really honestly where the harms are, who they fall upon, but also who the benefits are flowing to, and then crafting policy to address that and to make sure environmental justice communities get the benefits from this transition. So, in the US, we have the Justice 40 initiative. We have some programs and campaigns for that. And then we also have to look at procedural justice. So who's at the table, who's making decisions? Are people able to participate? And I think that a just pathway would really fund people in civil society to participate in decision making. So it's really hard. Sometimes there are public hearings or, for permits or stuff like that, but people can't really use those mechanisms to participate meaningfully if they're working all the time, or they don't have the transportation to get there, or it's not in their language. So there's a whole lot that the government could be doing to facilitate deeper public engagement and procedural justice. And then I also think that the dimension of recognition justice is important. So do the frameworks and discussions taking place really incorporate the values of people who are affected, the particulars of their situations? Those are just a few of the considerations I think we need to be bringing up more and more. And the environmental justice community is doing this.
Thank you, Holly. That's a really, really interesting approach. And following up, I wanted to ask also Simon if you have anything to add here. You've engaged a generation of artists and creative people to think in more complex and circuitous ways that new technologies like blockchain or crypto organize people, power, or ability to make decisions. And I was wondering if you could tell us about how you see a pathway to decarbonization in relation to technology.
Sure. I mean, a lot of what Holly said seems to cover some of this, but certainly speaking to the blockchain context in particular, I mean, it's hard to kind of make monolithic statements about something which is quite disparate in the way that it's applied. The claim of Web3 and blockchains is that it's about using, I guess, capital and redesigning it where it's applied and who gets access to it and who is able to be compensated financially or have a stake in projects. So it's about incentive design. And I think this is not outside of capitalism. It's kind of a rejig of capitalism in a particular way. So I wonder what Holly would think about that as well. But there are, for example, projects on blockchains like the Regan Network, which is a sort of a blockchain-focused project that allows kind of local confederacies of groups of people to come together and say, hey, we want to do, for example, a rewilding project of this particular space. and we want to have guidance and approval by people who are part of another network, and you can set up tokens that support those systems within that network. That's one way that's being done. There's other more poetic things. Artists, for example, that I've worked with, there's a group called TerraZero, which designed a project where blockchain systems enabled a forest, or are enabling a forest to own itself, essentially. So through a series of smart contracts, an industrial forest can, for example, claim the capital that it's producing. And so that's, again, like a redefinition of who owns what. Obviously, that's a kind of proof of concept for a particular type of financial infrastructure. And there are other ways that it could be applied beyond there as well. So maybe that's something.
Thank you. That's really, really interesting, because I think it taps also into questions that Holly brought up in her answer. Also thinking about the limitations, right, of our understanding of decarbonization, and what are the fundamental limitations that we're dealing with here. Is there anything you would like to respond to this, Holly?
I mean, in terms of what the limitations to decarbonization are, I think that they're pretty well known. I mean, vested interests blocking it or slowing it down, financing challenges, social acceptance, social knowledge about the problem and the scale of interventions that are needed to deal with it. And just a lack of trust in society, because, you know, people have not been included in much of the decision making to date, and you know, it's deeply unequal. So, you know, why should a community trust project developers just because their thing is green? I mean, there's no guarantee that the benefits will flow to them. So I think that's, you know, a really important underlying challenge. And it's interesting about the blockchain. Like, I understand the value in terms of harnessing a joint intention, as Adam Greenfield has put it. But then sometimes I wonder if it's kind of a techno fix for these problems of trust or for collaboration. Like, could we just develop trust by talking to each other and doing nice things for each other? Or do we really need, you know, the blockchain stuff for that? But I find it very interesting.
I mean, it's built from a particular set of, I mean, originally, whatever, but like a lot of the origins of these kinds of system designs come from a particular ideological, you know, position as well. And so I think certainly the Bitcoin blockchain, and when that was invented, so to speak, or whatever, unleashed, it came from a very particular ideological position, which is not, you know, which doesn't even necessarily include those ideas of it's aiming for a trustless world. It's where you don't have to interact with people, you don't have to trust the people you're transacting with, which has an ideological backdrop to it, which I think can be questioned. I think now that it's out there in the world, I think there are people trying to do different things with it than the same ideological position from which it was designed from, and maybe that's true with other technologies as well, and other industrial products. Yeah, I think that's an interesting space.
Thank you. Yeah, I was also thinking about how then will the technology for carbon capture and sequestration be scaled within this context that we're discussing here? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think that we will see some development in Europe. I think that there's a lot in the infrastructure and budget legislation in the US that's being debated right now that will kind of determine what its fate is here, at least in the short term. But really, you know, you can think about, okay, it needs a price on carbon. That's the conventional wisdom. You could also think about regulatory approaches. So yeah, I do think it's possible, but we have to really up our ambition on climate across the board. And I think that for, people have been thinking about carbon capture as an add-on to fossil fuel powered plants, but really the need is for industrial decarbonization. So things like cement and steel making, it's the best way to decarbonize these, speaking to architects, right? We will need steel and cement, right? So I think people are understanding that role in industrial decarbonization. And if we get serious on climate, then that's going to be one piece of it, is the carbon capture and storage there.
Simon, any thoughts, or can we?
I think Holly said it all.
Okay, yeah, definitely. And I think particularly thinking about regulatory practices, I was also thinking about how we're days away right now from COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland. And I'm thinking about how there are many national pursuits of green energy, green technology, and many criticisms about what those plans are a continuation of, particularly in, to be clear, in the context of neoliberal or colonial agendas. And Holly, you've mentioned in your work nationalizing carbon capture. And Simon, you've been critical of Adani mining and who tells that story. So from your own work, do you have any reflections about national level approaches to share? And could you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. I mean, I'd say that these neoliberal or colonial agendas are the dominant approach to green technology. But there is a lot of discussion about alternative frameworks, whether that comes in the form of the energy democracy movement or technology in the public interest. I think that a lot of this is going to fall under national level policy, but international organizations have some role in terms of setting out the methodologies for carbon, setting up these carbon accounting schemes. So there's a lot of this carbon logics that is kind of like the dominant form, right? Because these net zero goals, people all around the world have committed to net zero in countries, companies, cities. And that implies balancing some amount of continued emissions with some amount of removals or negative emissions. And so one key question there is what's the platform for exchanging all that? How is that accounting being done? Can we imagine a public sector platform that doesn't have finance capital taking a cut out of these transactions, that doesn't have finance capital speculating on these carbon futures? It's really transparent and accountable for people. Maybe blockchain is part of that. I haven't decided what I think about that, but people are arguing that too, right? Because there's a lot of fraud in these carbon markets, a lot of errors. They have a terrible history. So, there's a technological infrastructure for making that better, but there's also a regulatory one, right?
Yeah, and I think where blockchains might be able to come in is redesigning how capital behaves in theory, right? That's the claim of what it does and whom it can benefit. So if you have, for example, I guess like a project like this that then is able to also be accompanied by a design where the speculative, like attention gets to then, the capital that comes with speculative attention gets to flow back into funding these schemes. That's where I guess Web3 claims that it could, help. Again, yet to be proven.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that also kind of flows nicely into my next question, which is thinking that in 2021, a powerful and complex place we find ourselves in is as a planet, is that data and information have tended to be a key way to sort out the world. And this is currently being applied to carbon emissions, from carbon offsetting markets and credits to a swathe of research projects that measure the carbon output of our internet usage, cookies, data centers, and underwater cables. There's lots of different ways that our individual and collective carbon emissions are measured. And with it comes a set of emergent tensions around limitations on the categories we place on things, moralism, as well as personal doubts about their effectiveness and agency. And one recent example of that is a revelation that many tree planting projects linked to carbon credits are abandoned, not looked after, or create more carbon emissions than they are expected to reduce. And this speaks to the entanglement of our actions within wider systems, and that often we do not know the future of these projects. And I think that we here perhaps needs to be localized, right? I think I'm aware that I'm speaking within an institution located in the global north. Coming from the global south, as I do, you know that these projects end up like this because it is something that has happened repeatedly for 500 years. This is not a news to everyone. But I'm thinking in this question, what I want to do is to kind of understand the balance or position questions of uncertainty and individual accountability and responsibility. And here, as a direct prompt, Holly, as you have a book coming out on net zero, maybe you would like to kind of start us off on these reflections.
Sure, I'll start out by just saying that, one problem with net zero is that it takes the focus off of producing fossil fuels and it focuses our attention after the point of combustion on emissions. And so it focuses towards, individual consumers. And I think it's, neoliberal trap in that way where, we are in some ways accountable for our emissions, but we also know that there's deep structural factors that condition how much we can change and how. And so my book is called Ending Fossil Fuels because we need to focus back on production. So acknowledging that, what do we do about the emissions? Like you said, the carbon markets and credits are kind of a disaster. And part of it is these bureaucratic systems. So anthropologists Sarah Milne and Sago Mahanti have a great anthropological analysis of work they did in Cambodia around forest carbon schemes. And they refer to this as bureaucratic violence. They trace the ways these systems of validation and verification for carbon credits they commodify carbon and they produce value out of that land, like a measurable unit of tradable value. But in order to get those accreditations, the projects have to do things like exclude lands with indigenous communal title, because that title to the indigenous people that live there is seen as a risk to the permanence of the carbon. So these systems are kind of set up to work against human values and concerns because they're accountable to whomever buys that carbon credit. The communities are part of the picture, even when there are these so-called climate community and biodiversity standards. People in voluntary carbon markets have tried to kind of produce better standards, but they're still not delivering just because of the underlying logics in many cases. So can we imagine something better? I think yes, but let's also focus on the production side of it too.
From the non-production side, perhaps another connection to an artist project that I think is addressing this in some ways, also quite close to the Guggenheim, is there's a project called Art into Acres, which is focusing on long-term conservation as a way of working with artists who want to, or museums or other arts organizations who want to kind of commit to, while producing, also doing other things. So maybe this is part of the problem, but I think, yeah, this artist Hayley Mellon has set up this really interesting thing. And for example, for the Rem Koolhaas show, I know that she worked with the Guggenheim to produce some kind of long-term conservation at the same time as the show was being produced, which I thought was really interesting. And yeah, certainly something that's happening in the art world as we speak, that is one of the first things to try and address these types of things in ways that have like long-term impacts.
Okay, yeah, I was precisely going to ask you, Simon, how do accountability and responsibility feature in your own work that tends to often use tools, technologies, and systems that it is critiquing?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you know, my work is exploring and kind of trying to, I guess, take a second look at some of the claims of the industries that we are all kind of, as Holly mentioned, structurally forced to interact with, right? So it's very hard to, from an individual agent side, you know, withdraw from participating in this material. And I think that's where my work starts, but it also tries to ask questions about things and slightly shift the focus from the agenda that's set by the rhetoric of the industry, and trying to kind of use some of that to ask adjacent questions which are somehow obscured. So, I mean, in the Mine project, for example, I made these sculptures of kind of large industrial automation extraction machines, which are kind of very involved in all of in the production side of all of these things. But I also commissioned some drawings from a courtroom sketch artist that works in Brisbane. She's been working in courts for 30 years, and I asked her to make speculative sketches of the people at the helm of some of these industrial products, as if they were in courtroom environments, which has happened actually in Australia recently. Rio Tinto has been on trial for some of the things that we've been talking about, especially as it interacts with Indigenous land, which it does a lot, mining there, of course. It's they're interesting objects to kind of like look at, because it's also kind of improbable that the courts, that nation state systems that are of course connected to colonial histories and structures, would be calling into question the accountability of their own actors in a way, because of course industrial and commercial actors are, you know, working hand in hand with the state, and have been since the state was imposed in Australia. So yeah, that's some of the ways that I touch on some of those subjects in my work.
Thank you, Simon. That's really, really interesting. And I love the speculation also, and the trigger to imagining these particular actors that have such a massive impact in the planet and in how we relate to it, being put in that spot, in that position. Super, super interesting to think about that.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, it's so improbable that it would do anything, or that because it's sort of like, I don't know, it's kind of like that Spider-Man meme where they're all pointing at each other, but I don't know.
Yeah, and this is something that also, speaking as an artist, it's something that I really appreciate about the way that art gives you a space to think about these issues through also an understanding of the complexity of it, obviously, but also an understanding or a space to reflect on even how sometimes we're so entangled in these very issues that we're critiquing, that, you know, we become the Spider-Man meme. And to understand that this does not, and I think this is important to say, this does not remove the power of the critique, but instead I think it also actually highlights it, how deeply implicated. I mean, we are having this conversation through what? You know, where is this conversation even happening? Through the use of a number of artifacts. I'm in Europe. You're also in Europe, Simon. Holly, you're in the United States, right? So even just the fact that we are here speaking and talking about these things by using the very tools that we're discussing, and we're thinking about their impact in our lives and in the ways that we have to relate to one another, to land, to the planet, to political systems, and to historical processes too. And I keep bringing historical processes up because I think it's also super important to kind of position and localize these conversations within a continuum of coloniality. Do you have any further comments on this? Or maybe let's move on to the next question, which I think is also quite interesting and really relates to what we're talking about here. So in recent months, there's been a lot of debate in digital art and design circles about NFTs, which is a format for artists to sell their work online directly to anyone worldwide. And NFTs have been criticized for a number of things, from adding disproportionately to people's carbon footprint to the perpetuation of exhaustive and exploitative structures of art and labor. And this is a question more for Simon. I know that you use, or we start with Simon. I know that you use NFT in your most recent project. So could you tell us a little bit more about what this is and the reality that they could provide?
Yeah, I mean, I think the NFT context for art is really interesting. Also in terms of the way that, again, it's about, I mean, again, the claim of the promise of it is about being able to redefine how assets move around and how, you know, money behaves in art. And I think one of the amazing things which has been talked about that has happened really in an interesting way to change how artwork is produced and distributed with NFTs is that something that was proposed by a lot of people, but also by conceptual artists in the 60s, to have a resale contract written into secondary resales where an artist would get a royalty when a work is sold. So when kind of secondary value is produced, then there's a way to kind of like hold that and get access to that for the person who created the work. And people have tried to do that in contemporary art context for a while, but it's never really functioned. And it's become a norm in NFTs to have an automated part of the contract on resale to automatically deliver some of that value back on resale. And that's changed the way that artists make work for those environments, because the interests of the collector and the interests of the artist are more aligned. Like in the traditional art world, the ideal situation for me would be to create a unique work, send it to a collector, hopefully a museum, and then to never sell it again and, you know, keep it forever. In the NFT world, both the artist and the collector want it to be resold and continue to kind of move around commercially. And that just makes very, very different kinds of artwork possible and very different types of projects design. And with regards to the question of energy production and energy use in NFT infrastructure and blockchain infrastructure in general. I think there's a lot of confusion around this. There's been a real difficulty in measuring this, because what do you measure? Number one, what do you measure in terms of which energy is associated with, you know, from an artist's perspective, producing and storing an asset is actually quite a small amount of energy used on a blockchain, even on a proof of work blockchain, which is the kind of more energy intensive blockchains like Bitcoin and Ethereum currently use. Ethereum being the main blockchain network that is used for NFTs, the main marketplace is happening there. But actually it's more in the production and distribution of Ether, the currency that is used on Ethereum. So without going into too much detail, actually the more expensive an NFT is, the more energy use it has, because it consumes more power to make and move around the currency that buys it. But even in that context, Ethereum is moving towards proof of stake, which is this other less energy intensive way of producing blockchains. But you also lose something with that. The proof of work blockchain is designed to produce a particular sort of incentive structure for production and of value, which is hard to replicate in other ways. So, you know, people on the Bitcoin side who think that proof of work is the best way of doing that say that it's not a waste of energy, that it's rather a use of energy to produce a particular type of system, which is quite hard to produce. I mean, proof of stake systems, instead of putting, I guess like a reward system in energy to the network, it instead brings it into a place where people who hold more of the currency in the network are rewarded more. So is that a better system for governance of a network like that? I don't know. And then I guess there's another question, which would be about comparing blockchain artwork and distribution and production to other forms of artwork distribution and production, which is very energy intensive, flying around the world and storing things and, you know, producing large objects, etc. So I'm being told that we're reaching the edge of time here, so I'll leave it at that.
So these are super interesting questions, and that also personally as an artist, I would very much like to continue discussing, but unfortunately we are done with time. So I wanted to, and I think it's interesting also to end on these questions, right? So I wanted to thank you both for participating and for your really interesting contributions to this discussion. And thank you everyone at the Guggenheim again for putting up this event. And thank you to also all who watched this stream and this conversation.
Thank you so much, Louisa and Simon and Holly, for that discussion. We're back here at the Guggenheim and entering into our final session of the day.